The Curse of the River Queen. We were just looking for a fun weekend. You know how it is. 4 friends, a holiday, and a rented house in the bayou. New Orleans had been calling to us all year, and we finally made plans to escape the chaos of our lives in the city. I hadn't been back to the South since I was a kid, and the idea of spending a weekend near the water sounded like a good break from the grind. We weren't looking for trouble. We just wanted to relax and maybe hear a few ghost stories over some whiskey by the fire. But what we found out there in the swamps, well, we never expected it. We never imagined we'd come face to face with a legend we'd all thought was nothing more than an old wives' tale. But in those dark waters, something old and angry was waiting for us, something they called the River Queen. The bayou we'd rented the house near was isolated, about an hour outside New Orleans. We drove down winding roads, the kind where the trees seemed to reach out over you, their thick branches covered in Spanish moss, creating a tunnel that blocked out the sunlight. It was picturesque, peaceful even, until the shadows started to lengthen, and that peacefulness turned into something else, something heavy, like the air was charged with a secret we weren't meant to uncover. As we pulled up to the house, I could feel it already. The humidity was thick, the air oppressive. My skin prickled as we unloaded the car. The place was rustic, a 1-story house raised on stilts to protect it from the flooding that came with every storm. The dock behind it stretched out over the murky water, disappearing into the mist that clung to the bayou. "I don't like the look of this place," Nina muttered as she stepped out of the car. She glanced at the water, frowning. "Something feels off." Nina always had a sixth sense about things. She wasn't superstitious or anything, but growing up in a family steeped in Southern traditions and hoodoo, she had a connection to things the rest of us didn't. I waved her off with a laugh, more to ease my own nerves than anything. "Come on, it's just the swamp," I said, slinging a bag over my shoulder. "We're here to have fun. Relax, Nina. You'll feel better after a drink." But as I said it, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. There was something about the stillness of the water, the way the trees hung low, their reflections distorted in the murky depths, that made me think Nina might be onto something. Still, I brushed it off. We were here to unwind, and I wasn't going to let a creepy atmosphere ruin that. We spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, drinking, laughing, and catching up. Marcus, the eternal jokester, kept us all entertained, and soon enough, the tension began to fade. By the time the sun started to set, casting the swamp in hues of deep orange and purple, we were around the fire, telling stories. Inevitably, talk turned to the local legends. There are a lot of them down here. Ghosts, creatures in the water, voodoo spirits, and curses. But it was when Nina brought up the River Queen that things shifted. "The River Queen," she said, staring into the flames, her voice low, "isn't just a story. She's real. My grandma used to tell me about her when I was little. She said the queen was once a woman, a priestess of the water spirits, but she was betrayed, drowned by the very people she trusted. And now her spirit haunts the bayou, dragging anyone who disrespects the water down with her." We all fell silent. I couldn't help but glance at the dark water behind the house. The fire crackled, but it felt like the swamp had grown quieter, like it was listening. Marcus, of course, was the first to break the silence with a laugh. "That's some creepy shit, Nina. But come on, we're here to party, not get spooked by some old ghost story." Nina's eyes didn't leave the fire. "It's not just a ghost story, Marcus. You can laugh all you want, but you better show respect while we're here." He waved her off, but I saw it, the way his gaze flicked to the water, just for a second, before he turned back to the bottle of whiskey in his hand. That night, after the fire died down and we stumbled back to the house, I couldn't sleep. The windows in my room faced the bayou, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark, still water. It wasn't just the usual swamp creatures I was worried about. It was something else, something deeper. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise. Something wet, something dragging against the dock. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. At first, I thought it was just the water lapping at the posts, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate, like something or someone was moving out there. I crept out of bed and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see outside. The moonlight glistened on the water, and for a moment I saw nothing but the mist rising off the bayou. But then, something shifted in the shadows. A figure standing at the end of the dock, almost blending into the night. It was tall, with long hair hanging down its back, and it seemed to be swaying, like it was part of the mist itself. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. It was late, I was half asleep, maybe I'd imagined it. But when I looked again, the water was still, too still. The rest of the night was restless. I woke up several times, each time expecting to hear that dragging sound again. But the house was quiet, and by the time the sun rose, I convinced myself it had just been a dream. The next day, we tried to shake off the eerie vibes from the night before. We spent the morning fishing off the dock, drinking beers and telling jokes. But when Marcus went to check the lines after lunch, he didn't come back. At first, we thought he was messing with us, trying to scare us after Nina's story. But after an hour passed with no sign of him, we started to get worried. We searched the house, the dock, the edges of the bayou, calling his name. But Marcus was gone, vanished without a trace. Nina was the first to suggest what none of us wanted to hear. "It's the River Queen," she said, her voice trembling. "She's taken him." I wanted to argue, to call it ridiculous, but the look in her eyes stopped me. Nina didn't scare easily, but she was terrified. And deep down, I was too. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by water, and something about Marcus's disappearance felt wrong. That night, the atmosphere had changed. The air was thick, suffocating, and the usual chorus of frogs and insects had gone silent. We stayed inside, the doors locked, but the tension was unbearable. Every little creak of the house sent us jumping out of our skin. Around midnight, the dragging sound came again. It started softly, like something wet moving slowly through the water. I looked at Nina and Jasmine, both of them pale and wide-eyed. We knew it wasn't Marcus. It couldn't be. Nina grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't go out there," she whispered. "It's her, the River Queen. She's coming for us." The sound grew louder, closer, and then silence. I could feel it, though. She was out there, waiting. We huddled together, too scared to move, too scared to look outside. And then from the darkness came a voice. Soft, almost melodic, but with an edge of something cruel. "Come to the water." I froze. The voice was coming from the dock. It was unmistakably female, sweet and inviting, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away. Nina's grip tightened on my arm. "She's trying to lure us out," she whispered. "Don't listen." But Jasmine wasn't listening. She stood up, her eyes wide and glassy, like she was in a trance. "Jasmine, no!" I shouted, grabbing her arm, but she jerked away from me, moving toward the door like she couldn't hear me at all. The voice came again, gentle but insistent. "Come to the water." Before I could stop her, Jasmine threw open the door and ran out into the night. I chased after her, but when I reached the dock, she was already at the edge, her feet on the slick wood, her body leaning forward as if she were about to step into the bayou. I grabbed her just in time, pulling her back from the water. But as I did, I saw it, something rising from the depths, a shape almost human, with long, flowing hair and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. She reached out with a pale, slender hand, her fingers curling, and for a moment, I thought she would take Jasmine from me right then and there. But instead, she smiled, a slow, eerie smile that chilled me to the bone, and then sank back into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. I dragged Jasmine back into the house, slamming the door behind us. She was shaking, her eyes wide with terror, but she was alive. We all were, for now. By the third night, it was just me, Nina, and Jasmine, huddled together in the house, waiting for the inevitable. We had no car. Marcus had the keys when he disappeared, and no way to call for help. The bayou had cut us off, trapping us in its grasp. The River Queen wasn't done with us. We knew that. She had taken Marcus, and she would take the rest of us if we didn't find a way out. But every time we tried to leave the house, the water seemed to rise, creeping closer to the door, as if the bayou itself was keeping us prisoner. The final night, the storm came. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the twisted trees and the churning water. The house shook with the force of the wind, and the rain pounded against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. And then we heard it, the voice. Come to the water. It was louder this time, more insistent. The River Queen wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding. We barricaded the doors, but it didn't matter. The water started seeping in through the cracks in the floorboards, rising faster than we could stop it. In minutes, the entire floor was submerged. Nina grabbed my hand, her voice barely audible over the storm. "We have to give her something," she said. "An offering." I didn't know what she meant, but there was no time to argue. The water was up to our ankles, and the voice was getting louder, closer. "Come to the water." Nina ran to the fireplace where we had left the old bottles of whiskey and food from the night before. She grabbed them, muttering something under her breath, something in a language I didn't understand, and threw the bottles into the water. The voice stopped. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if the bayou itself was holding its breath. Then slowly, the water began to recede. We didn't question it. We didn't wait to see if the River Queen would change her mind. We ran. We left the house in a frenzy, my heart pounding in my chest as the storm raged around us. The water had receded from inside the house, but outside, the bayou was overflowing, the water lapping at the edges of the dock and swallowing the path that led back to the car. "Nina, what the hell did you say back there?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. I didn't know if it was the offering, her words, or sheer luck that had saved us, but I needed answers. She shook her head, still panting from the mad dash out of the house. "I don't know exactly. It was something my grandma taught me. Some old prayers to the spirits of the water. I wasn't sure it would work." "But it did," Jasmine whispered, her eyes wide with shock, her body trembling. She was still in a daze from what had happened at the dock, and I could see she was barely holding it together. We kept moving, our shoes sloshing through the thick mud as the storm pelted us with rain. The car wasn't far, but every step felt like an eternity. The air was electric, alive with the presence of something we couldn't see, but could feel all around us. Even with the temporary reprieve, I couldn't shake the feeling that the River Queen was still watching, waiting for her next move. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure appeared in the trees, just at the edge of the bayou, tall, with long, flowing hair and eyes that glowed like fireflies in the storm. It was her, the River Queen. She wasn't done with us yet. "Nina!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and pointing toward the figure. She froze, her eyes locking on the shadowy shape in the distance. "She's here," Nina whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's following us." The River Queen stood still, her figure barely visible through the sheets of rain, but there was no mistaking her. She was coming for us, and I had no doubt that the offering had only bought us time, nothing more. We ran harder, the mud sucking at our shoes, the wind whipping at our clothes. The car came into view, parked under a thick canopy of trees that creaked and swayed with the force of the storm. But just as we reached it, the water surged again, rushing across the ground and forming a barrier between us and our escape. "God damn it!" I shouted, looking at the flood in disbelief. The bayou was rising fast, faster than any natural storm could explain. This wasn't nature, this was her. Jasmine collapsed to the ground, sobbing. "We're not going to make it. She's going to take us all." Nina knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "No, she's not. We're going to get out of here. We just need to..." But before she could finish, the voice came again. "Come to the water." It was louder now, closer, and there was no mistaking the malice in the River Queen's tone. She wasn't playing games anymore. I looked around, my mind racing. There had to be another way, some other path out of this nightmare. But everywhere I looked, the water was rising, closing in on us. The Queen's figure moved closer, her presence growing more solid with each passing second. Her long, ghostly hair billowed around her in the wind, and her glowing eyes locked onto us with a predatory intensity. She wasn't going to let us go. "Nina, we need another offering," I said, my voice trembling. "Whatever you did before, it's not enough. She's still coming." Nina's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. "I'll try. I'll do it again." She stood, her hands trembling as she reached for the bag she had brought with her. We had packed a few essentials when we'd left the house, but nothing that could help us now. "Except, maybe, whiskey," Nina muttered. "We need to offer her more." She fumbled with the bag, pulling out the bottle of whiskey we had been drinking earlier. She held it up, her voice shaking as she began to chant again, the same words she had muttered by the fire. But this time, the River Queen didn't stop. The ground beneath us trembled, and the water surged forward, rising to our knees. I could feel it, cold, wet fingers wrapping around my ankles, pulling me toward the bayou. The Queen wasn't going to wait any longer. "Nina!" I shouted, panic setting in. "It's not working!" Nina's chanting grew louder, more frantic, but the Queen kept coming. I could see her face now, pale and twisted with rage, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her hand reached out toward us, her fingers long and thin, sharp like claws. Jasmine screamed, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her up from the mud. "We need to move, now!" But the water was too strong. It pulled at us with the force of a riptide, dragging us closer to the bayou. I could feel it, the cold, the darkness, the pull of something ancient and hungry. The Queen was going to take us all, just like she had taken Marcus. And then, just as I thought we were lost, Nina stopped chanting. I looked at her, confused, but before I could say anything, she did something I never expected. She took the whiskey bottle in her hands and smashed it against a rock, the glass shattering in the rain. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, panic rising in my throat. But Nina didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, holding the broken bottle in her hand. The Queen stopped moving, her glowing eyes narrowing as she watched Nina approach. "I'm not giving you whiskey," Nina said, her voice steady and strong. "You want something from us? Take me." "Nina, no!" I shouted, but she didn't stop. She walked toward the water, toward the Queen, and I could see the resolve in her eyes. She was offering herself, offering her life in exchange for ours. The River Queen hesitated, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't read. For a moment I thought she would take the offer, take Nina and leave the rest of us alone. But then the Queen smiled. It was a horrible, twisted smile, full of malice and cruelty. And in that moment I knew she wasn't going to take Nina. She was going to take all of us. The water surged forward again, this time with a force that knocked us off our feet. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me as the water rushed over my head. I tried to stand, but the current was too strong, pulling me under, pulling me toward the bayou. I could see Nina, still standing, still holding the broken bottle, but the water was rising around her too. She was trying to fight it, trying to hold her ground, but the queen was too strong. And then, just as I thought I was about to drown, the water stopped. I gasped for air, coughing and sputtering as I struggled to my feet. The bayou was still, the water no longer rising. The storm had calmed, the wind had died down, and the queen, she was gone. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Nina was standing at the edge of the water, her arms limp at her sides, her face pale and drawn. Jasmine was huddled on the ground, shaking and sobbing. We were alive. Somehow, we had survived. But as I looked out at the bayou, at the still, dark water, I knew that the queen wasn't finished with us. She had let us go for now. But she would always be there, waiting, watching, just beneath the surface. We never found Marcus. We searched for days, combing the bayou, talking to the locals, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had never existed, as if the bayou had swallowed him whole and erased every sign that he had ever been there. Nina and I went back to the city after that, but things were never the same. The nightmares started almost immediately. Dreams of the River Queen, standing at the edge of the water, her glowing eyes fixed on me, her voice echoing in my mind. Come to the water. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the sound of her voice still ringing in my ears. I knew she was still out there, still waiting for the day when I would return to the bayou. Jasmine never recovered. She moved away, far from the south, far from the water, but I heard through mutual friends that she was never the same. She was haunted, just like me. We had escaped the queen, but not the memory of her, not the knowledge that she was still out there. Nina, well, Nina was stronger than the rest of us. She went back to her roots, studying the old ways, learning more about the spirits and the forces that had saved us that night. She told me once, over the phone, that she believed the queen had let us go because of the offering, not the whiskey, but the sacrifice. I was ready to give my life, Nina had said, and she saw that. She took mercy on us. I wasn't sure I believed that. I wasn't sure if the River Queen even knew the meaning of mercy. But one thing I did know. No one who crossed her path ever left unscathed. And I knew deep down that someday I would have to face her again. Because no matter how far I ran, no matter how long I tried to forget, the Queen was always there, watching, waiting. Come to the water.
The Wrath of the Crossroads Spirit. Growing up in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, I had always heard whispers about the Crossroads Spirit. There was something about the wide expanse of land where dirt roads crisscrossed under the moonlight, where people went to seek favors, make deals, and sometimes disappear. My grandma would tell me that the Crossroads was a place where the physical world and the spiritual world met, a place where the dead could speak to the living. I was a practical man, though. I didn't have time for folklore or ghost stories. As a highway contractor, my job was to bring the future to places that had been stuck in the past for far too long. So when the opportunity came to expand the major highway cutting through the Mississippi Delta, I didn't think twice. Sure, there were old burial grounds nearby, and some folks claimed the land was sacred, but I wasn't one to believe in curses or spirits. The project started smoothly. We cleared land, tore up the old roads, and laid the foundation for the new highway that would run right through the crossroads, a place people around here seemed unusually afraid of. The night before the real work began, I was sitting in my office trailer poring over blueprints when Henry, one of my oldest workers, knocked on the door. Henry was a local, born and raised in the Delta. He had seen the world change around him but still held on to the old ways. He was a good worker, but he often let superstition get in the way of logic. "Boss," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. His face was serious, his eyes darting around the room like he didn't want anyone else to hear what he was about to say. "You know what they say about that place, don't you?" I looked up from my plans, more amused than anything. "Let me guess, more ghost stories?" Henry didn't smile. He pulled out an old, worn Bible from his back pocket and clutched it in his hands. "They say folks used to come to this very crossroads, right here where we're building, to make deals with the devil himself. You can't just tear up the land like it's nothing. There's power here. Power that don't like to be disturbed." I sighed, pushing the blueprints aside. "Henry, you've been working for me for what? 20 years? You know I don't go for that kind of talk. We're building a road, nothing more." But Henry wasn't backing down. He took a deep breath and continued. "I know you don't believe in it, but I do. My granddaddy used to tell me about the Crossroads Spirit. He said it's not just some old tale to scare folks. It's real. You make a deal here, and it sticks. You tear up this ground without paying respect, and the Spirit comes for you." I waved him off. "We're building a highway, Henry. No deals, no spirits." But something in his eyes made me pause. There was genuine fear there, the kind that comes from seeing something you can't explain. Henry had always been a level-headed man, but now he looked like he was staring death in the face. "Just be careful," he muttered, leaving the office with his Bible still clutched in his hand. I shook off the conversation, but that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Henry had left with me. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as I thought about the stories my grandma used to tell me when I was a boy. Stories about crossroads, about deals made in the dead of night under a full moon. She used to say that the Crossroads Spirit wasn't evil, but it wasn't kind either. It gave as much as it took. The next morning, the work began in earnest. We were halfway through clearing the land when one of the machines just stopped working. The engine died, and no matter how much we tried, it wouldn't start again. It was an old machine, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then one by one, the other machines started malfunctioning. By midday, the crew was getting jumpy. They were locals like Henry, and I could see the unease growing in their eyes. There was a heaviness in the air, a thick, humid weight that pressed down on us all. The sky had darkened, even though the forecast called for clear skies and the wind was picking up, swirling the dust around the crossroads. Henry approached me again, this time more insistent. "We need to stop. We need to make an offering." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "An offering? To what? A spirit?" He nodded solemnly. "If we don't, the Crossroads Spirit will come for us. It always does when you disturb the balance." I could feel the tension in the crew. They were looking to me, waiting for a decision. If I ignored Henry, I'd lose control of the situation. But if I stopped work to make an offering to a spirit I didn't believe in, I'd be giving in to fear. I couldn't afford that. "We keep working," I said, my voice firm. But the moment the words left my mouth, the ground beneath us rumbled. The machines started shaking, and the wind howled, ripping through the trees with a force that seemed unnatural. The sky, once just overcast, had turned an ominous shade of black, and then we heard it. Laughter. Low, deep, and coming from all directions. The crew scattered. Some ran for their trucks, others dropped their tools and took off into the woods. I stood there, frozen, as the laughter grew louder. It was like the land itself was laughing at me, mocking me for my arrogance. Then I saw him. At the center of the crossroads, a figure appeared, tall and shadowy, with glowing red eyes that cut through the dark. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, just like my grandma used to describe, and in his hands, he held a cane that he tapped rhythmically against the ground. Each tap sent a tremor through the earth. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground as the Crossroads Spirit slowly approached. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some old wives' tale. This was real, and I had disturbed something ancient and powerful. "You've come to my crossroads," the Spirit said, his voice like thunder rolling through the sky. "And you haven't paid your respects." I wanted to run, to scream, to beg for forgiveness. but all I could do was stand there, my heart pounding in my chest. The spirit raised his cane, and the ground cracked beneath my feet, opening up like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. "You owe a debt," the spirit said, his eyes burning with fire. "And I always collect." I stood there, paralyzed, feeling the weight of his words crush down on me. The air was thick with dread, and the sky above swirled with dark clouds. My mind raced as I struggled to understand how it had come to this. I didn't believe in any of it. Spirits, curses, old folklore. But standing at that crossroads, face to face with something otherworldly, I had no choice but to believe. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and cracks snaked outward from where the spirit tapped his cane. The vibrations grew stronger with each tap, and I felt the earth pulling at me, as if it were trying to drag me down into some dark abyss. "You can't just take me," I blurted out, my voice shaky. "I didn't know. I didn't make any deals." The spirit tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. His glowing red eyes never left mine, but the tapping of his cane paused. "The crossroads isn't about deals you know about," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It's about respect. This place, it demands balance. When you come to the crossroads, you owe it something. Always." I swallowed hard, the reality of my situation sinking in. The workers had fled, the machines had broken down, and the land itself had turned against me. And now I stood alone at the mercy of something I had laughed off as a myth. I can fix this," I stammered. "What do you want? Money? A sacrifice? I'll make it right." The spirit's face didn't change, but I could feel his amusement, like a dark cloud rolling over me. He stepped closer, and the coldness of his presence washed over me, chilling me to the bone. "There's no bargaining with the crossroads, boy," he said, his voice like a rumble of distant thunder. "You disturbed the balance. Now, the balance must be restored." I took a step back, my legs shaky and unsteady. The cracks in the ground seemed to widen, and I could feel the earth shifting beneath me. I glanced over my shoulder, desperately searching for a way out, but I knew it was too late. The Crossroads Spirit had come for me, and there was no escaping him. He lifted his cane again, and this time he pointed it directly at me. The wind howled through the trees, whipping dust and debris into the air. The ground beneath me shook violently, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. "You've taken from this land," the Spirit said, his voice rising with the storm. "Now it will take from you." The cracks in the earth deepened, and I felt the pull, stronger this time. The dirt beneath me shifted, crumbling away as if the land itself was opening up to swallow me whole. Panic surged through me, and I clawed at the ground, trying to hold on, but it was no use. The pull was too strong. Just as I thought I would be dragged down into the depths of the earth, everything stopped. The wind died down, the ground settled, and the Crossroads Spirit lowered his cane. For a moment, there was an eerie stillness, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had been spared. But then, he spoke again. "You've been warned," he said, his voice softer now, but no less terrifying. "Leave this place, and never return." I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and without a second thought I turned and ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, away from the crossroads, away from the spirit, away from the nightmare I had unwittingly unleashed. Days later, I didn't go back to the work site after that. The construction was halted indefinitely, and the company sent a team of new contractors to assess the situation. They didn't believe my story, of course. Who would? I barely believed it myself, and I had lived through it. I told them the machines had broken down, that the land was unstable, that it wasn't safe to continue, but I left out the part about the Crossroads Spirit. No one would take me seriously. They'd call me crazy. They'd laugh me out of the business. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on. I tried to forget what had happened, tried to convince myself that it was just a bad dream, that my mind had played tricks on me. But the whispers never stopped. At night, when the world was quiet and still, I would hear them. Faint at first, just on the edge of my consciousness, like a distant echo. But as the nights wore on, they grew louder, clearer, I could hear the spirit's voice, low and chilling, calling my name. He was waiting. Waiting for me to come back. Waiting for me to make things right. But I couldn't go back. I wouldn't. I had barely escaped with my life the first time, and I wasn't about to tempt fate again. I stayed far away from the crossroads, from the land, from anything that reminded me of that night. But the spirit didn't forget. He never forgot. Months later. By the time the summer heat faded into the cool, crisp air of fall, I had convinced myself that the nightmare was behind me. The company had moved on, the project had been abandoned, and life was returning to normal. Or so I thought. It started with small things at first. My truck broke down on the highway, right at the intersection where two old dirt roads crossed. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just a coincidence, I told myself. Then, the power in my house started flickering at odd hours of the night, always around midnight. The lights would go out for just a few seconds, long enough for me to feel the darkness pressing in around me. But it was the dreams that really shook me. Every night, I dreamed of the crossroads. I was standing there, alone in the middle of the night, and the spirit was watching me. Always watching. His red eyes glowed in the darkness, and his cane tapped the ground rhythmically, each tap echoing through my bones. In the dreams, I could never move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The spirit would slowly approach, and just as he reached out to touch me, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I tried everything to make the dream stop. I went to doctors, therapists, even tried sleeping pills, but nothing worked. Every night, the same dream. Every night, the spirit got closer. It was late November when I finally broke. The nightmares, the whispers, the sense of being watched. It was too much. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to face him, to make things right, whatever that meant. I drove out to the crossroads late one night, just after midnight. The sky was dark, no moon in sight, and the air was thick with the smell of rain. The road was empty, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires as I pulled up to the place where it had all started. I got out of the truck, my hands shaking, and walked to the center of the crossroads. The wind howled around me, and the trees swayed ominously in the distance. I could feel him before I saw him. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. He was here. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing in the exact spot where I had first seen him. The Crossroads Spirit. His eyes glowed in the darkness, and the shadows seemed to cling to him like a cloak. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. "I'm here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what you want, but I'm here." The spirit tilted his head, his red eyes narrowing. "You owe a debt," he said, his voice like a distant thunderclap. I swallowed hard. I didn't mean to." He raised his cane, cutting me off. The ground rumbled beneath my feet, and I felt the same pull I had felt that night, months ago. The earth shifted, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. "There's no escaping the crossroads," the spirit said, his voice cold and final. "You disturbed the balance. Now the balance must be restored." I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what was to come. I could feel the ground crumbling beneath me, the earth opening up like a mouth, ready to swallow me whole. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. The spirit lowered his cane, and the wind died down. I opened my eyes, confused. He was still standing there, watching me, but something had changed. His eyes weren't filled with rage anymore. There was something else. Understanding. "You've come back," he said, his voice softer now. "You've shown respect." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. The spirit took a step back, the shadows around him swirling like mist. "Leave this place," he said, "and never return." I scrambled to my feet, backing away slowly. The spirit watched me for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone in the silence of the crossroads. I got in my truck and drove away, not looking back. I knew I had been given a second chance, but the spirit's warning echoed in my mind. I had disturbed the balance once. I wouldn't get another chance.
The spirit of the Underground Railroad. I've always been a man of facts, growing up in Detroit, in a world where everything had an explanation, a reason. It's why I became a historian. There's a certain peace that comes from digging through archives, sorting through documents, and understanding how the pieces of the past fit together to form the present. So, when I received a grant to explore old Underground Railroad routes in the rural South, I thought it would be nothing more than another historical investigation. But history is never just about facts. There are stories buried in the land, in the air itself, stories that can't always be explained. I found that out the hard way. My research took me to a small town in Tennessee. It was a sleepy place, one that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The roads were narrow and unpaved, the houses old and weathered. I had come to this town for one reason: to document a series of tunnels that had been used by runaway slaves escaping northward during the Civil War. These tunnels had been long abandoned, but according to local legend, they still held the spirits of those who had passed through them. The day I arrived, I met with Mrs. Eleanor, an elderly woman who had lived in the town her whole life. She was the town's unofficial historian and the keeper of its secrets. Her small, one-story house sat at the edge of the woods, just a short walk from where the tunnels were rumored to begin. "You're not the first to come looking for the tunnels," Mrs. Eleanor said, pouring me a cup of tea as we sat in her cramped living room. "But most folks don't last long. There's something down there, something that doesn't like to be disturbed." I raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about the spirits?" She nodded, her expression serious. "They say the tunnels were a gateway to freedom, but for many they became a tomb. Some never made it to the north. They died down there, in the dark, and their spirits, well, they linger." I tried not to let her words get to me. I'd heard stories like this before, old tales passed down through generations to keep people away from places they shouldn't be. But I was a man of logic. There was no reason to believe in ghosts. "I'm not here to disturb anything," I assured her. "I just want to document the history, make sure it's preserved." Mrs. Eleanor gave me a sad smile. "You might not mean to disturb them, but the dead don't care about your intentions. They care about respect." After thanking Mrs. Eleanor for her advice, I left her house and made my way to the site. The directions she gave me took me through a thick grove of trees at the edge of town. It was a beautiful, quiet walk, the kind where the air is crisp and filled with the smells of pine and fresh earth. The tranquility should have comforted me, but instead I felt an eerie sense of anticipation. The sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting long, wavering shadows along the ground. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air felt charged with something I couldn't quite place, a tension I had never experienced before. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I was about to descend into tunnels that had been used by people risking their lives for freedom. The weight of their history was pressing on me, and I couldn't ignore the sense of reverence that came with it. The map I'd been given was crude, but effective. After about a mile, I found the entrance to the tunnels. They were hidden beneath a thick layer of vines and overgrowth, just as Mrs. Eleanor had described. The stone archway was partially collapsed, and the opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. A faint chill ran down my spine as I stood before the entrance, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The temperature dropped immediately as I descended. The air grew damp and heavy, carrying the smell of mold and earth. My flashlight illuminated the rough stone walls, and I could see the remnants of old wooden beams that had once supported the tunnel's roof. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the physical weight of being underground. It was something else, a feeling, a presence. I shook off the sensation and focused on my task. This was just another historical site, another piece of the past that needed to be documented. But as I moved deeper into the tunnel, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if the very walls of the tunnel were alive, breathing in sync with me, waiting. About half an hour into my exploration, I reached a small chamber off the main tunnel. It was barely large enough to stand in, with a low ceiling and dirt covering the floor. In the corner, partially buried in the earth, was an old lantern. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal the rusted metal and cracked glass. It was a relic of the past, a piece of the history I had come to document. But as I held the lantern in my hands, I heard something, faint at first, but unmistakable. A voice, soft and distant, like the murmur of someone whispering just out of reach. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The voice was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of my own breathing, but it was there. I wasn't alone. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the tunnel. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I stood there, gripping the lantern, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, just as I began to convince myself that it had been my imagination, the voice returned. This time, it was louder. The words were unclear, garbled like someone speaking underwater, but there was a desperation in the tone. It was pleading, begging. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the voice echoed through the tunnel, growing louder, more frantic. I stumbled backward, dropping the lantern as I scrambled to turn on my flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. The tunnel was empty, but the voice didn't stop. It grew louder still, filling the tunnel with its desperate cries. I could hear more voices now, overlapping, blending together into a cacophony of anguish and fear. It was as if the very walls were alive, vibrating with the energy of the souls trapped within them. And then, through the chaos of the voices, I heard one word, clear and distinct. "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted, my heart hammering in my chest as I ran back down the tunnel. The voices followed me, their cries growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the tunnel itself was trying to pull me back. I don't know how long I ran. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. My flashlight flickered as I stumbled through the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, the voices stayed with me. They were all around me, above me, below me, whispering, shouting, pleading. The tunnel was alive with their cries, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. I skidded to a halt, gasping for breath as I shone my flashlight around the tunnel. The air was still, the tunnel was silent, but I knew I wasn't alone. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, I felt a cold breeze brush past me. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew stronger, more deliberate, as if something was moving through the tunnel with me. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the walls, and that's when I saw it. A figure, vague and indistinct, stood at the far end of the tunnel. Its form was shrouded in darkness, but I could see the faint outline of a person, their head bowed and their shoulders hunched as if they were carrying an unbearable weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as I took a step back. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the uneven walls of the tunnel, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The figure raised its head slowly, and for the briefest moment, I saw its eyes, hollow, empty, filled with a sadness that cut through me like a knife. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The air grew still once more, and the tunnel was silent. But the feeling of being watched remained. I didn't wait to see if the figure would return. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the tunnel as I made my way back to the surface. I could still feel the presence behind me, following me, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally emerged from the tunnel and into the daylight, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The sunlight was warm on my skin, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the tunnel. But even as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I knew that what I had experienced wasn't over. The spirits of the Underground Railroad were still with me, their presence lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It started as a subtle sensation, the feeling of eyes on me, watching me from the shadows. At first, I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a natural reaction to what I had experienced in the tunnels. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just a sensation anymore, it was a presence. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At night, I would wake to the sound of footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. And then came the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the tunnels. I was back underground, surrounded by the cold, damp air and the suffocating darkness. The voices were there too, whispering, pleading, begging for release. But no matter how hard I tried to help them, no matter how far I ran, I could never escape. The worst part was the figure. It was always there, standing at the far end of the tunnel, watching me with its hollow eyes. It never spoke, never moved, but I could feel its pain, its anger. I had disturbed their rest, and now they wanted something from me. I knew I couldn't continue like this. The spirits of the Underground Railroad had attached themselves to me, and they wouldn't let go until I made things right. I went back to Mrs. Eleanor, desperate for answers. When I told her what had happened, she wasn't surprised. "You didn't listen," she said, shaking her head. "I warned you. Those tunnels are sacred. You can't just walk in there without paying your respects." "I didn't mean to disrespect them," I said, my voice trembling. "I just wanted to document the history." Mrs. Eleanor's eyes softened. "I know you didn't mean any harm, but the dead don't care about your intentions. They only care about how they've been treated." She paused, her gaze distant. "There's only one way to make things right. You have to go back. You have to acknowledge them, honor their memory." I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my chest. The thought of returning to the tunnels was terrifying, but I knew she was right. I couldn't ignore the spirits forever. The next day, I gathered a small group of locals, along with Mrs. Eleanor, and we returned to the site. This time we brought offerings, flowers, food, and candles. We stood at the entrance to the tunnels, and Mrs. Eleanor led us in a quiet ceremony, calling on the spirits of the Underground Railroad to rest in peace. As we stood there, the air seemed to grow lighter. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the place began to lift, and for the first time since my arrival, I felt a sense of peace. The spirits had been acknowledged, they had been respected, and they were finally free. In the weeks that followed, the dreams stopped. The feeling of being watched faded, and the voices that had haunted me in the tunnels were silent. I continued my research, documenting the history of the Underground Railroad and the brave souls who had risked everything for their freedom. But I never returned to the tunnels. I had learned my lesson. History isn't just facts and dates. It's a living, breathing thing, shaped by the people who lived it. And sometimes those people aren't ready to be forgotten. The spirits of the Underground Railroad still linger in the shadows, watching over the places they once traveled, protecting the memories of those who came before us. And now, I carry their memory with me too.
The haunting of the plantation fields. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories, tales passed down from my grandmother about spirits lingering in the fields, watching, waiting for justice that never came. But those were just stories, right? My world was built on the here and now. I grew up in Atlanta, and by the time I was 25, I had left behind my family's rural past for the promise of the city. When my cousin James called me to help him out on a restoration project down in Louisiana, I almost said no. James had always been the family historian, obsessed with digging up our roots, especially the ones buried deep in the antebellum South. He had bought an old plantation house, one that had stood abandoned for decades, overgrown with weeds and soaked in centuries of history. It was a massive property, one that stretched across hundreds of acres of fields, lined with oak trees and wrapped in the heavy, humid air of the bayou. "Man, it's a good investment," James said on the phone. "We're going to turn it into a museum, you know, something that shows the real history, none of that sugar-coated stuff. People need to remember what happened on this land." I hesitated, but I eventually agreed. I wasn't one for restoration work, but I knew what he meant about preserving history. Our family had roots that went back generations, and some of those roots were tangled in the blood-soaked soil of plantations like this one. I arrived on a sweltering July afternoon, the sun baking the land beneath my feet as I pulled up to the house. The building itself was massive, a crumbling two-story structure with peeling paint and broken windows. It looked like it had been pulled straight out of a horror movie, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for someone to come back. James was already there, standing on the porch with a clipboard in hand, looking as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. "Welcome to Oak Hollow Plantation," he said with a grin. "What do you think?" I looked up at the house, the weight of its history pressing down on me. The front steps were cracked, the wood splintering under the weight of years, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. "I think you've got your work cut out for you," I replied, stepping out of the car. James waved me inside, eager to show me the work he had already started. The house was in rough shape, but underneath the layers of dust and grime, I could see the bones of what had once been a grand estate. The floors creaked beneath our feet as we walked through the main hall, the wallpaper peeling away in long strips. But it was the land outside that caught my attention, the vast fields stretching out behind the house, overgrown with weeds and wild grasses. I walked to the back door, staring out at the fields as a strange sense of unease crept over me. It wasn't just the dilapidated house or the oppressive heat. It was something else, something about the land itself. James joined me, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The fields are where most of the work happened back in the day," he said. "Slaves planted, harvested, and died out there. This land has seen a lot of suffering." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy blanket. I had read about plantations, of course. We all had. But standing there staring at the fields where people had lived and died under the cruel yoke of slavery, it became real in a way that I hadn't expected. That night, after a long day of working to clear some of the debris from the house, James and I settled into the small guest cabin on the property. It was a basic setup, a few beds, a tiny kitchen, and enough space to sleep while we worked on restoring the main house. The air outside was thick with humidity, and the sound of cicadas buzzed through the night. As I lay in bed trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cabin was quiet, but the fields outside, it was like they were alive, whispering just beneath the surface. I rolled over, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. It started as a faint rustling sound, like wind moving through the tall grass. But there was no wind. The air outside was still, the trees unmoving. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just rustling anymore. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the field toward the cabin. I froze, listening intently, my pulse quickening. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear something else now. Soft voices, murmuring in the darkness, like a group of people talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. I stood up, my body tense as I moved toward the window. I pulled back the curtain and peered out into the night. The fields were bathed in moonlight, the tall grasses swaying slightly in the breeze that hadn't been there a moment ago. But I didn't see anyone. No figures, no movement. Just the empty, endless expanse of the plantation fields. But the footsteps didn't stop. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. I knew what I had heard. Someone, something was out there, walking through the fields, and those voices. They weren't just in my head. They were real. I shook James awake, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "Hear what?" "Listen," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The footsteps, the voices." James blinked, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he sat up fully, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, just as I thought I had imagined it all, the voices returned, soft, whispering, moving through the fields outside. James stood up, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" We both stood there, frozen in place, listening as the footsteps and voices moved closer, circling the cabin. It was like we were being surrounded, trapped by something unseen. "We need to go," James said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." We grabbed our flashlights and hurried outside, our hearts pounding in our chests as we stepped into the humid night air. The voices were still there, faint but present, drifting through the fields like a breeze that didn't belong. James shone his flashlight toward the fields, sweeping the beam across the tall grasses. "Do you see anything?" he asked, his voice tense. I shook my head, my pulse racing. "No, but I can feel it. Something's out there." We stood there for what felt like hours, scanning the fields, waiting for something, anything, to reveal itself. But nothing came. The voices faded, the footsteps ceased, and the night returned to its eerie silence. We didn't go back to the cabin that night. Instead, we sat on the porch, our flashlights in hand, too shaken to sleep. The land had been quiet for decades, but that night, it had come alive. And I knew deep down that we had disturbed something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The next morning, the atmosphere had changed. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Even the birds seemed quieter, as though the weight of the plantation's history was pressing down on everything. We decided to focus on the interior of the house, hoping to avoid any further encounters with whatever lurked in the fields. As the days passed, the activity inside the house became more pronounced. It started small. Objects would move on their own, and we would hear faint whispers echoing through the hallways. At first, James and I tried to rationalize it, blaming the creaky old house and our overactive imaginations. But soon, there was no denying that something was wrong. One afternoon, while we were working in the parlor, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the wall. It was rhythmic, like someone was knocking softly, but the noise was too regular to be random. I looked over at James, who had also stopped working, his brow furrowed. "You hear that?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded slowly, standing up to investigate. "It's coming from inside the wall." We both approached the spot where the sound was strongest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though someone or something was trying to get our attention. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I pressed my ear against the wall, my pulse racing. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then I heard it, the soft sound of a woman's voice, muffled by the wall but unmistakable. "They're coming," she whispered. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" James nodded, his face pale. Yeah, we need to get out of here. But before we could move, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the lights flickered. The air grew heavy, and I could feel the presence of something watching us. Then the whispers started again, this time louder, more urgent. They echoed through the house, coming from every direction at once. They're coming. That night, we decided to investigate the fields again. The voices had returned, louder and more insistent than before. The house no longer felt safe, and the fields, despite their eerie presence, seemed like the only place to confront whatever was haunting us. We grabbed our flashlights and headed out, our breaths visible in the cold night air. The sky was clear, the moon casting long shadows across the overgrown fields. As we made our way through the grass, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed around us. "We're not alone," James whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, my flashlight sweeping the ground ahead of us. The voices were louder now, clear enough to understand. They were calling out to us, pleading, begging for something we couldn't give. "Help us." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to know what was out there, what was haunting this land. We reached the far edge of the field, where the trees began to thicken, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. It was here that the air felt different, thicker, heavier. There was a presence here, something old and powerful. And then we saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving through the trees like a dark mist. But as we watched, the shadows began to take shape, figures, tall and thin, their bodies translucent, but unmistakably human. They moved slowly, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted with pain and sorrow. "These are the ones who died here," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "The slaves who never made it out." The figures didn't seem to notice us at first. They moved with purpose, as though they were reliving their final moments, trapped in a cycle of suffering that they could never escape. But then, one of the figures turned toward us. Her eyes were dark, empty voids, and her face was etched with the weight of centuries of pain. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and bony, as though she was trying to pull us into her world. "We suffered here," she said, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "And now, you will suffer too." I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the weight of her gaze. It was as though the land itself was holding me there, forcing me to confront the horror of what had happened on this soil. James grabbed my arm, his voice frantic. "We need to go, now!" But I couldn't move. The figures were closing in, their eyes filled with rage and sorrow. I could feel their pain, their anger, centuries of injustice that had been buried beneath the surface of this land. "We will never leave," the woman whispered, her hand inches from my face. "We are bound to this place, and now, so are you." Just as I thought I would be consumed by the figures, James yanked me backward, breaking the spell that had held me in place. We ran through the fields, our footsteps pounding against the earth as the figures followed us, their voices growing louder and more insistent. When we reached the house, we slammed the door shut behind us, our breaths ragged and our hearts racing. The air inside was stifling, and the house creaked and groaned as though it were alive. "We need to leave," James said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." I nodded, knowing that he was right. The land was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered and died here. We had disturbed their rest, and they would never let us leave in peace. But before we could gather our things, the door swung open on its own, and the cold night air rushed into the house. The figures were there, standing in the doorway, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "You cannot leave," the woman said, her voice echoing through the house. "This is our home now. You will suffer as we have suffered." The room grew colder, and I could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on me. It was suffocating, unbearable. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air as the figures closed in around us. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. The house was silent once more. James and I looked at each other, our bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. We had escaped, but I knew that we would never be free of this place. The spirits of the plantation would haunt us forever.
The Voodoo Queen's Revenge. Growing up in New Orleans, you learn early on that there are certain things you don't mess with. The city is full of life. Its streets are always buzzing with music, food, and people. But just beneath that lively surface, there's another side. A darker side. A side of the city that most tourists don't get to see, where the lines between the living and the dead blur, and where the spirits of the past still linger. I used to think it was all just part of the city's mystique, the kind of thing they sell to tourists along with voodoo dolls and cheap fortune readings. I never believed in any of it, not really, but that all changed when I took a job restoring an old mansion in the French Quarter, a mansion that once belonged to one of the most powerful figures in the history of New Orleans, the Voodoo Queen. Her name was Marie Toussaint, and back in the early 1800s, she was feared and revered by everyone in the city. Some said she could heal the sick with a single touch. Others claimed she could curse entire families, bringing ruin to their name for generations. But one thing was for sure: no one, not even the wealthy white families that ruled the city, dared to cross her. Not until she died, anyway. According to the stories, Marie Toussaint had been betrayed by those she trusted most. A group of wealthy landowners who had once sought her help turned on her, accusing her of witchcraft and blaming her for the mysterious deaths of several of their family members. They had her arrested, tried, and executed. But before she died, Marie Toussaint swore revenge. She promised that her spirit would never rest, and that those who wronged her and their descendants would suffer the consequences. And now, more than 2 centuries later, I was standing in front of her house, the mansion she had once called home. The Toussaint mansion was a massive, crumbling structure that had been abandoned for decades. Its tall, wrought iron gates were rusted, the stone walls cracked and covered in ivy. The windows, many of them shattered, stared out at the street like empty, hollow eyes. It was a daunting sight, and as I stood there, staring up at the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was thick with humidity, and the faint sound of jazz music drifted in from a nearby bar. But the mansion itself was silent, dead silent. I had been hired by the city to oversee the restoration of the mansion. The plan was to turn it into a museum, something that would preserve the history of the Voodoo Queen and draw in tourists. It was a big job, one that would take months, if not years, to complete. But it was also the kind of job that could make my career. I couldn't pass it up. Still, as I stood there staring at the house, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. There was something about the mansion, something about the air around it, that felt wrong. Like the house itself was alive, waiting for something. Or someone. I shook off the feeling and made my way up the cracked stone steps to the front door. The massive wooden door was warped from years of neglect, and it took some effort to push it open. The inside of the mansion was just as dilapidated as the outside. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The main hall was massive, with high ceilings and ornate chandeliers that had long since lost their luster. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside, and I could hear the faint sound of rats scurrying in the walls. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting the state of the house for the restoration team. As I moved through the hall, I noticed something strange. There were symbols carved into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize. They were crude, almost like scratches, but there was something deliberate about them. I snapped a few photos and made a mental note to look them up later. As I continued through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow in the corners of the rooms. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time I reached the second floor, the sense of unease had grown to a dull roar in the back of my mind. The air up here was heavier, and the smell of decay was stronger. I made my way down the long, narrow hallway, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. At the end of the hall was a door, different from the others. It was smaller, older, and covered in dust. Something about it drew me in. I pushed the door open, revealing a small, cramped room that looked like it hadn't been touched in over 100 years. The room was bare, except for a single chair in the center and a mirror on the far wall. The mirror was old, its surface cracked and tarnished, but it caught the light in a way that made it seem almost alive. I don't know why I did it, but I stepped inside the room. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath in the air. The room itself seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing down on me like a weight. And then, I saw her. At first, it was just a flicker in the mirror, a shadow that didn't belong. But as I stared, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, tall and regal, dressed in a flowing gown that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her face was obscured, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but the air around her seemed to pulse with a dark, heavy energy. It was like the house itself was alive, feeding off the presence of this spirit. This woman. I turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. I had seen something real. And whatever it wasn't friendly. After that night, everything changed. The mansion, which had once been nothing more than a crumbling relic of the past, came alive with a malevolent energy. It wasn't just the flickering shadows or the cold spots in the air, it was something deeper, something more sinister. Every night, as the restoration crew worked, we would hear strange noises. Footsteps echoing through the halls, the sound of doors slamming shut on their own, and, most disturbingly, the sound of a woman singing. It was a soft, melodic tune, but there was something haunting about it, something that sent chills down my spine every time I heard it. At first, I tried to brush it off as my imagination. The mansion was old, after all, and old houses made noise. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. One night I was working late, reviewing some blueprints in the study. The rest of the crew had already left for the day, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt heavy, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, like it was watching me, waiting for something. As I worked, I heard the soft sound of footsteps coming from the hallway outside. At first I ignored it, figuring it was just the house settling, but the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I slowly made my way to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the hallway. It was empty, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again, the woman from the mirror. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, her gown flowing around her like mist. Her face was still obscured, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. The Voodoo Queen wasn't gone. She was still here, trapped in this house, and she wasn't happy. It wasn't long before the rest of the crew started experiencing strange things as well. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in places no one had been. Lights would flicker on and off, even though the wiring in the house was ancient and barely functional. And then, there were the shadows. Dark, fleeting shapes that seemed to move just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. But it wasn't until one of the workers, a man named Andre, went missing that we realized how serious things had become. Andre had been working on the roof late one afternoon, helping to reinforce some of the older beams that were on the verge of collapsing. He was a quiet guy, never one for ghost stories or superstition, but that day, something had changed. He was on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be watching him. We all noticed it, but no one said anything. After all, we were all feeling a bit uneasy in that house by now. That evening, as we wrapped up for the day, we realized that Andre hadn't come down from the roof. At first, we thought he might have just left early, tired of the strange happenings. But when his truck was still parked out front, and his tools were scattered across the roof, panic set in. "Andre!" James, the foreman, called out as we scoured the house. We searched every room, every hallway, every corner of the property, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had just vanished. The police were called, and a search was conducted, but no one ever found Andre. He had disappeared without a trace, and that's when the rumors started to spread. Some of the crew refused to come back to the mansion, convinced that it was cursed, that the Voodoo Queen had taken her revenge on Andre for disturbing her home. Others, myself included, weren't quite sure what to believe. But one thing was certain: something was very wrong with that house. After Andre's disappearance, I started having dreams. They weren't normal dreams, though. They felt more like memories. In them, I was standing in the middle of the mansion, but it wasn't in its current state of decay. The house was grand, beautiful, its walls adorned with gold and the finest tapestries. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, and the house was full of people, dressed in elegant clothing, their faces alight with joy. But as I watched, the scene began to change. The music slowed, the laughter faded, and the light drained from the room. One by one, the guests vanished, until I was standing alone in the grand hall, the chandeliers flickering above me. And then she appeared. Marie Toussaint. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her dark eyes piercing through me, her face a mask of fury and pain. She didn't speak, but I could feel her anger. It was a living thing, coiling around me, suffocating me. Her gown, once elegant, was now tattered, and her skin had turned a sickly gray. She raised her hand, and I could feel an invisible force pushing me backward, forcing me to my knees. I tried to scream, to move, but I was paralyzed. She stepped down the staircase, her feet barely touching the ground as she approached. When she stood in front of me, she leaned down, her face inches from mine. Her breath was cold, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was a low, guttural whisper that echoed through the empty mansion. "You are in my house now. You will suffer, as I have suffered." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the dream, it had felt so real. I could still feel the cold air of the mansion around me, still hear the echo of her voice in my ears. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just stress, that the events at the mansion were getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Marie Toussaint wasn't just a story, she was real. And she wasn't going to let us finish this restoration without making us pay for what had been done to her. The next day, I went back to Mrs. Delphine, an old woman who lived in the quarter and was known as a local voodoo priestess. She was the one who had warned me not to disturb the spirits of the mansion when I first took on the project. At the time, I hadn't believed her. Now, I was starting to think I should have listened. Mrs. Delphine lived in a small, cluttered house filled with candles, charms, and all manner of strange artifacts. When I arrived, she was sitting at her kitchen table, reading over an old book, her face serious. "You've come back," she said, without looking up. "I was wondering when you would." I sat down across from her, trying to hide the fear that had been gnawing at me since Andre disappeared. "I think something's wrong with the mansion," I said. "Andre's gone, and I keep seeing her, Marie Toussaint, in my dreams." Mrs. Delphine finally looked up at me, her dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe. "Marie Toussaint's spirit is not one that rests easily," she said. "She was wronged, and now her soul is bound to that house. She will not let anyone disturb it, not until she has her revenge." "What can we do?" I asked, my voice desperate. "How do we stop her?" Mrs. Delphine sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You cannot stop her, but you can appease her. You must find the truth of what happened to her. Only then will her spirit find peace." I frowned, confused. "But I already know what happened. She was betrayed, tried for witchcraft, and executed. That is only part of the story, Mrs. Delphine said. There is more, much more, that has been forgotten. You must uncover the full truth, the truth that has been buried. I left Mrs. Delphine's house with more questions than answers, but I knew she was right. There was more to Marie Toussaint's story than what the history books had recorded. If I was going to save the mansion, and the lives of the crew working there, I had to find out what that was. I spent the next several days digging through old records, visiting libraries, and interviewing locals who had grown up hearing stories about the Voodoo Queen. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Marie Toussaint had been more than just a voodoo priestess. She had been a healer, a protector of her people, a woman who used her knowledge of the old ways to help those in need. She had treated the sick, defended the weak, and challenged the corrupt. And that was why she had been targeted. The wealthy landowners who had accused her of witchcraft hadn't done so because they feared her power. They had done so because she had stood in the way of their greed. Marie Toussaint had helped enslaved people escape, had cursed the crops of plantation owners who treated their workers cruelly, had fought for the rights of those who had no voice, and for that, they had killed her. But what the history books didn't mention was the final betrayal. Marie had not been killed in some public execution. She had been lynched, dragged from her home in the dead of night, and hung from a tree in the courtyard of her own mansion. Her body had been left there for days, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the power of the wealthy elite. It was a story that had been buried, hidden from the official records. But the land remembered, and Marie's spirit had never forgotten. With the truth finally uncovered, I knew what I had to do. Mrs. Delphine had been right. Marie's spirit couldn't rest until she was given justice, and I was the only one who could help her. I returned to Mrs. Delphine's house and told her everything I had learned. She nodded, her expression grave. "There is a way to release her," she said, "but it will not be easy. The ritual must be performed at the site of her death, on the grounds of the mansion. You must confront her spirit and offer her the justice she was denied." I felt a chill run down my spine at the thought of confronting Marie's spirit again, but I knew there was no other choice. The mansion had claimed one life already, and I wasn't about to let it claim more. That night, armed with the knowledge Mrs. Delphine had given me, I returned to the mansion. The air was thick with tension, and the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it knew what was about to happen. I made my way to the courtyard, where the tree that had once been used to hang Marie still stood, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like twisted arms. The air was cold, and the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, like it was soaked in the blood of the past. Mrs. Delphine had prepared me for the ritual, giving me a series of chants and offerings to present to Marie's spirit. I laid out the offerings, candles, herbs, and a small vial of blood that Mrs. Delphine had insisted was necessary. As I lit the candles, the wind began to pick up, swirling around me in a violent gust. And then, she appeared. Marie Toussaint. She stood beneath the tree, her eyes dark and filled with fury. Her gown, once elegant and regal, was torn and blood-stained, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her presence was overwhelming, and I could feel the weight of her anger pressing down on me like a physical force. "You come to offer me peace?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. "You think you can give me what was taken from me?" I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "I know what happened to you, Marie. I know the truth. You were wronged, and I'm here to help you get justice." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the courtyard. "Justice? There is no justice for the dead." I took a deep breath and began the chant that Mrs. Delphine had taught me. The words were ancient, their meaning lost to time, but as I spoke them, I could feel the energy around me shift. The wind died down, and the air grew still. Marie watched me, her eyes narrowing as I continued the ritual. For a moment I thought it was working. The darkness in her eyes seemed to fade, and the oppressive weight of her presence began to lift. But then, something changed. The air grew cold again, and a shadow passed over Marie's face. Her eyes darkened once more, and the fury returned. "No! she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "It's not enough." Before I could react, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the courtyard into darkness. The wind howled, and I could feel the ground beneath me tremble as Marie's spirit lashed out. "You cannot fix what has been done," she screamed, her voice echoing through the night. "I will have my revenge." The tree behind her shook violently, its branches whipping through the air like the arms of some monstrous creature. The ground cracked open, and the air was filled with the sound of voices, whispers, screams, all blending together in a cacophony of anguish and rage. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I tried to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. Marie's spirit had been awakened, and her fury was unstoppable. As the ground beneath me continued to crack and shift, I knew that there was only one way to stop her. Mrs. Delphine had warned me that if the ritual failed, there would be no turning back. Marie Toussaint's spirit would be free to exact her revenge on anyone who set foot on the mansion's grounds. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last offering, a small iron knife that Mrs. Delphine had given me. It was a relic of the old days, a tool used in rituals to bind spirits to the earth. If I could use it to cut the ties that bound Marie to the mansion, I might be able to stop her. But it wouldn't be easy. As I raised the knife, Marie's spirit lunged at me, her face twisted with rage. I barely had time to react as she slammed into me, sending me crashing to the ground. The knife slipped from my hand, landing several feet away. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a plan. Marie was everywhere, her form shifting and flickering in and out of the shadows. The air was thick with her presence, and I could feel her anger pulsing through the ground like a living thing. "You will suffer!" she screamed, her voice filling the night. I reached for the knife, my fingers closing around the cold metal just as Marie's spirit lunged at me again. This time, I was ready. I swung the knife, the blade cutting through the air as I chanted the final words of the ritual. For a moment, everything went still. Marie's spirit froze, her eyes wide with shock as the knife cut through the invisible bonds that tied her to the mansion. The ground beneath me stopped shaking, and the wind died down. Marie looked at me, her expression softening for the first time. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, she was gone. The air was still, the night silent. The mansion, once filled with a dark, oppressive energy, felt empty. The weight that had pressed down on me for so long had lifted, and I knew that Marie Toussaint's spirit had finally found peace. The next morning I returned to the mansion with Mrs. Delphine. The house was quiet, its halls no longer filled with the flickering shadows or the whispers of the past. The crew returned and the restoration resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The house, once alive with a malevolent energy, was now just that, a house. Marie Toussaint's story was one of tragedy and betrayal, but in the end, she had been given the justice she deserved. The mansion would stand as a testament to her legacy, not as a place of fear, but as a reminder of the strength and resilience of those who had been wronged. As I left the mansion for the final time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The Voodoo Queen had found her peace, and in doing so, she had given the city a piece of its history back. But I would never forget the feeling of her eyes on me, the sound of her voice whispering through the night. Some things, I realized, are too powerful to ever truly disappear.